get started here. So you've got your, we can talk more, but what you want to do is just start running.
Okay.
And then get those to me and we can start talking about, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you got my, have you sent me something? An update? Can you do that today?
Yeah, no
Just tell me what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing as I say, the one comment, oh great, how are you? And my comment on the export of refined petroleum.
Oh yeah.
That's a lot of countries, for example, and probably your country gets its refined from Singapore, I would think, I would guess. You don't have refineries in your country.
I'm not sure.
I don't think you do.
Yeah.
Your country is too small.
Yeah.
Most of in that area, much of the refining, for example, comes from Singapore. Indonesia doesn't have much refining capacity. They have a lot of oil, but they don't refine. They don't refine it. That's very common in developing countries. Philippines doesn't have any refining. I remember looking. I was interested in whether you could set up a refining plant in Philippines to refine for plastics. The Philippines has to import all of its plastic resin. But basically the market is too small. In the Philippines, believe it's 100 million people, but the market isn't big enough to support a refining facility. So they import all of their plastic resin, for example. So they don't refine it in the Philippines. So you see that a lot. Nigeria, Venezuela exports oil
America.
to the U.S. refined in the Gulf Coast, and then it gets exported back to. And in fact, the refineries in the Gulf Coast are designed for the dirtier. The Venezuelan oil is much dirtier. What you were talking for, what's called West Texas Intermediate, that WTI, that's a benchmark. That means it's a sweet. It's a sweet light oil, and so the other, like your Venezuelan, a lot of your Mexican oils are a dirtier oil, and so their value is lower because it takes more energy to refine them. So that's another thing to keep when you think about the oil market. Gas is relatively clean. Gas is just it's. At any rate, let's get started with. This is actually lecture 13. I'll change that. I realize I didn't change that. Otherwise, I'm going to start basically with where we left off the last time. We're going to go over the political systems and economic development. And I think this is an interesting topic because there's clearly some relationship between economic development and a certain degree of what you would call some degree of freedom, and people have to have some kind of freedom in order to do that. In order to create companies, you have to have a certain. Certainly, when you have a lot of corruption. Corruption means you have to pay government officials to get anything done. That means that government officials have to, when they have to get paid a lot of money, then it's hard to start a business. And so countries that have corruption, it's difficult to start a business. Those are countries usually dominated by a few small businesses. So you have that. But it's not quite so clear. One of the things that can happen in a country like China, there's a very authoritarian government, and yet there's a certain degree of economic freedom. The United States actually has a lot of economic freedom, but certain areas of control. Japan has certain areas where there's a lot of control, and yet there's also a lot of economic freedom. But it's something that's always a little, it's almost on a case-by-case basis that we have to consider that. And we'll start here. I think this is where I left off, but I'll start up here again with the corruption index for Europe. And the thing we can see is that your northern European countries, and we're talking about your Germanic countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and UK and the Scandinavian countries tend to be considered to be a lower corruption. That's kind of historical situation. You can they've had functioning governments for a long time, and functioning political system, and relatively low level of corruption, hundreds of years of economic development. France has as well. Probably for France, it's a little bit lower than some of these northern European countries. France has long been a very centralized government, and I think this is part of the issue as well, because the Japanese political system is somewhat modeled, somewhat similar to the French system. And in fact, the French system is very much controlled from Paris. It's very central control. The central government controls a lot of what goes on in the country. And if that sounds familiar, then it's very similar to the central government in this country. Central government in this country has a lot of control, and as a result, Paris is a very large city. Paris has a significant percentage of the French population. Tokyo has a significant percentage of the Japanese population, and probably for the same reason. There's a lot of centralized control. And so because of that, I think that probably suggests why the French score seems a little bit lower. There's certainly a lot of freedom, but when you have that kind of centralized control, it means you have to go through a lot of bureaucracy. So that's something to keep in mind. What are we talking about here in terms of freedom and corruption? So the UK may be less corrupt because, well, its government may have less control, and that may be the case in Holland, and some of that may be just a characteristic of the society. Swiss is very high. There's a lot of autonomy in Switzerland. The Swiss people are very different groups. There's three major different languages in that small country, and they have a lot of they're separate. They have a lot of local control, and that's part of it as well. And probably to some degree, there's a degree of local. When you have a lot of local control, that gets a higher score, as opposed to a centralized society government like Spain. I'm sorry, France. And Spain is another very centralized, or at least historically centralized. And I mentioned a little bit about that. Ikushima-san wants to talk about Spain. I know he'll probably be here a little bit late, but I'll make that comment for him when he sees the video later. That Spain has a lot of centralized power in Madrid, but the regions are very strong as well. So there's a real pull in Spain. Italy is traditionally a very Italy is even less of a. One of the problems with Spain is it's not really quite a country. It's a lot of different regions that have a lot of different characteristics. Italy is even more so. Italy is a country that, if you've ever been there, it's actually many different countries with many different languages. Historically, for the last 1,500 years, it was a lot of small city-states. It was really, especially in the north, and so there's a lot of very local. There's a lot of very local characteristics, but and a lot of corruption. There's a lot of corruption. I mentioned also about this part of the world, the Balkans and Eastern Europe, that this was once under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was centered in Turkey and Istanbul. The former Constantinople, which is located right there, was the center of that empire. So you can see that certainly has affected, had a historical effect. So that's history. History has that impact. Then you have countries like Ukraine, historically a lot of corruption. And what's interesting is that Ukraine, although it broke away from Russia, and there's Russia, it broke away from Russia, it is considered to have a lot of corruption. And there's also clearly some impact on economic development. There's a lack of rule of law. I have a friend here who made an investment in Ukraine. He invested in a farm, and he lost all of his. It turned out there was a lot of corruption involved, and he basically, I think he lost most or all of his investment, and so the result is when you have that kind of situation, people don't invest. They're afraid to invest. So that's a real problem, is when you have that kind of situation. Unless you know somebody higher ups, it's your investments aren't safe. It was a local investment. He made a local investment. It wasn't a higher up. It's just very risky. So that's part of it as well. When you have that kind of corruption, that is real corruption. When you have that, you will get less economic development. Nobody in hearing that story, I'm not going to run out and invest in Ukraine. I wouldn't do it, and I'm sure he'll never invest any more money there either. So that's the kind of picture in Europe, Eastern Europe. You can see the Central European countries. There's less because these countries were part of the Soviet bloc. They were outside of the Western Europe for a long time. You can see this is the change over the 2015, and I mentioned that you've got a lot of improvement in this part of the world, the Balkans. Here, there's been a lot of change, particularly in Romania. Romania has seen a lot of change, a real transformation of that country. The Eastern European countries, and this was the effect of breaking away from Russia and from the Soviet Union. This significant improvement in scores, and again, all of these countries were once part of the Soviet bloc. These three countries, the Baltic states here, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. As I say, Turkey has seen an improvement. I don't quite, I don't understand. Some of this is very political. It's because people, in some of those countries that are red, I think it's just because they might not like the politicians that run that country. And here's an important point. Well, all that wonderful democracy, and this is some of the world's slowest economic growth rate over a 15-year period, so great. That democracy didn't produce a lot of economic growth over that period. And in fact, they had all this democracy in a country like Britain, and basically you've had a rebellion in countries like Britain that have the working classes rebelled against a system that seems that seems not to be in their interest. And certainly, as we know, we had the vote against for Britain to leave the economic union, the European Union, now a year and a half ago. So that was a major event. But we've seen Europe. The other thing here is that most of these countries are part of the Eurozone, and I think the Euro has been a disaster. I also mentioned the effect of high energy costs. I think that's had some impact. The countries like Germany that got very excited. These countries have gotten very excited about renewable energy. Well, it's very expensive. It may be helping the environment, maybe to some small degree, but it's probably having a negative impact on the average person, the average, especially the average working person. So, and what's interesting there, let's go back. If you were going to run a correlation, if you were going to run a correlation between democracy and economic development, it would probably be, in this period in Europe, it would probably be negative. So here's an interesting thing. There's Belarus. Belarus is probably easily the most corrupt country in Europe. And let's go back there just to go back to previous. See that? That's Belarus. That's Belarus right there. And that is considered to be Europe's last dictatorship. The President Lyshenko. And yet it's showing some of the most rapid growth rates in Europe during that period. In Russia is at least done okay, certainly better than Western Europe, although fueled by primarily oil prices. And that's the case here in a country like Azerbaijan. There, that's the dark blue. And you can see, it doesn't, is that not? No, it didn't come up. It didn't have a score, did it? No, it didn't have a score. Okay. And you can see there's Georgia. Georgia had, Georgia, which is considered to be fairly free country. North America, we talked about Africa last time. North America, Canada is generally considered to be, you can see Canada is a darker blue than the United States. It's probably a more, Canada is more like a European, Northern European country. It's certainly more, it has more of the values of a it feels more like a Northern European country than does certainly the United States. The United States, of course, has its own characteristic that's very different. And in part because it's just people from all over the world. There's been such a large immigration in the United States, and that's probably had in no small degree of impact. And of course now we can see the Latin American countries. Mexico is considered below normal, somewhere in the 30s. It's not. That's kind of like and then Central America, these are like Africa, considered in terms of in terms of corruption. Mexico, a lot of corruption. There's a lot of corruption. Drug gangs have a major impact on that country. That's certainly the illegal drug trade and the illegal immigration to the United States. That's driving no small amount of corruption in these countries. These are countries that have had a lot of historical political upheaval. That's Guatemala there, Honduras. That's probably one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. That's Nicaragua. Again, a lot of political turmoil. All of those. El Salvador has as well. Interestingly, that's considered by Transparency International to be less corrupt. There's Costa Rica. Costa Rica is quite an interesting country. It's for some reason it's very stable. It's been a very stable country for decades, and it actually has no military. It's a country without a military. So that's very interesting. In a part of the world. This is a part of the world where all these countries have very strong militaries. So that's very interesting. If you're interested in one of the things you'll want to consider is what's the effect of military spending and having military on level of corruption. Certainly, these are countries where the military is very strong and very repressive. And then here's Costa Rica without a military. And it's considered quite a relatively free country. Panama is a relatively free country. It's probably considered a bit corrupt. There's a lot of money there. It's kind of a financial center now. There's a lot of money laundering. It's a, as I say, with the Panama Papers that came out, that's exposed a lot of that in Panama. But and I met somebody recently who was running a legal gambling operation. He was a bettor, a big bettor in Las Vegas, and he was also based in Panama, which I thought was very interesting. But I didn't ask what he was doing. I didn't ask what he was doing there or why he was there. You know, it's just okay. He told me, he said, "I'm in Panama." Very nice, very good. This is Cuba, which is considered. That's curious. That is considered to be. Is considered to be less corrupt. That's an interesting. That's quite interesting. Some people would consider it very, very corrupt, especially the Cuban refugees in Florida would disagree. That's Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti. That's the Dominican Republic there. The score change really hasn't been much in the Americas. There's relatively little change. If it's towards white, that means it hasn't changed much over the 15-year period. It's interesting. That's Costa Rica. Has had a big improvement, modest improvement in these quite corrupt countries, a big improvement in Cuba. And Cuba has become more free. It certainly is. Its economy's opened up a little bit. Of course, it's historically a communist country. Recently, Fidel Castro died, so he had been the president of that country for many decades, and in fact had led the revolution that made Cuba a communist country in 1959. But you can see it's not a major changes, political changes. Other than that, not a lot of big changes. And again, we've got these countries that have had relatively below normal, below median growth rates compared with the world. These countries that are free and have free democracies and all of that, you know, this is wonderful Canada, and they've had very slow economic growth. Mexico less free, but there's it's about the same really, not much different. You know, here's and some of these countries that are more corrupt, well, they've had a little bit, but they've done a little bit better. Then Panama, with all of that corruption, has done a relatively amount of corruption has done quite well. People putting their money in Panama, the many wealthy people of the world are putting their money there. That's why that's a dark blue as a reflection, which is probably a little bit of a reflection of corruption. You know, so it's kind of an interesting story there. So you can see this. It's a mixed picture. I will go to South America. South America is a very is quite a contrast, and it really comes out in this map. I like this map. Really talks about some of the historical corruption. You know, the historical picture of corruption. If any country that I think was less corrupt than you might have expected, it's Brazil. Brazil is actually going through a lot of the president. You've had president forced to resign, basically impeached, and president was impeached recently. And maybe part of it is that there's been so many corruption, and some of that also reflected there was tainted meat that was produced. One of the world's biggest exporters of meat is Brazil, and it turned out that they were exporting sub-quality meat. That's not really a good thing to do for your reputation. You know, so there's where corruption can really have a problem. They were paying, it was the largest meat packer was paying people off, and well, then finding out that they were exporting some tainted meat, that'll destroy your business. That's not good for business. But this also probably indicates that you're reading, sometimes when you read about a lot of corruption, it might mean that they're actually doing something about it. So that's the good thing about Brazil. Then you have a country, here's Venezuela. That's really, and I've talked about that before, it's going through a lot of crisis. It's a real political crisis. It's kind of becoming a bit of a dictatorship now. One of the interesting things about a country like that, and you see this a lot in Latin America, and in terms of political systems and economic freedom, most of these countries, and this is also true for the Central American countries as well, are run by descendants of the Spanish that went to that country that part of the world 500 years ago. That in fact and are descendants. They're in many of these countries. You're talking about we're kind of from, well, let's say from Paraguay. These countries that they're run by the descendants of the original Spanish conquistadors. Those people that came from Spain in the early 16th century. And they really established a system that was very much Spanish culture and a kind of domination that has historically produced very strong rulers, strong men. They're called caudillo. The caudillo system, the caudillo type of strong ruler. And they tend to have a lot of autocratic, a lot of dictatorships, a lot of repression of the minorities, of the native minority people. There's been a lot of repression of that. It's interesting. You also see that if you're familiar. Has anybody traveled to the Philippines? If you'll meet the people who run the Philippines are descendants, are to a large degree are fairly direct descendants from that 1% of the population is a direct descendant. We'll get to that a little bit later, but the point here is that in many cases the people that run these countries there's that very strong flavor that from the conquest of that part of the world by the Spanish. So we've got Venezuela is that case. Here's Paraguay. Paraguay, very, very corrupt, historically very corrupt, government, very strong, historically strong rulers. I think it's changed, it's gotten a little bit better, but that's still been certainly a strong flavor, and certainly one of the poor, probably, well, not the poorest. This is usually probably the poorest countries in South America, but a relatively poor country, Paraguay is. Bolivia is interesting because it's run by, this is the majority of native peoples. And now the president of that country is a native. Is a native 100%. I think he's 100% native Andean. Morella. That's close, but he's kind of a little bit of an autocrat. That's the problem in this part of the world is that you have this historical, you've had a bit of a revolution there, a bit of in Bolivia, but it's basically the traditional power structure has been overthrown in the last 20 years. Which is also the case, of course, in Venezuela. And again, a lot of disparities in income, that's part of it as well. Uruguay is traditionally quite less corruption. And it's also very European. This is probably the most, in terms of Europe, of settlers from, and I mean Europe, not non-Spanish, non-Spanish. A lot of Italians and Germans in Uruguay. It's a small country, only about 3 million people. So that's part of it. So it's kind of very European, which is interesting because Argentina is also quite European as well, and yet it's quite. You would call it pretty corrupt. It's had a lot of problems. Argentina is interesting because the immigrants are from Germany and Italy. That's dominated by Germans and descendants of Germans and Italians, and it's the only place in the Western Hemisphere where people immigrated from Europe and they ended up poorer than their ancestors. So that was that's a very interesting case. This was one of the richest countries in the world in 1900. It was considered one of the richest countries in the world in 1900, and it really it's gone relatively downhill. Chile is very interesting because I think it's a fascinating country in terms of, and if you follow, they just had a presidential election the other day. They just had an election, center-right president. They've had kind of center-right, a little bit, some center-left, but center-right. But this was a country that in 1972 elected a communist in Allende as president, and that Allende was overthrown in a coup that was engineered by the United States, and a military dictatorship was established, and quite brutal dictatorship. That was by Pinochet, General Pinochet. That was eventually was overthrown, and now it's become quite relatively free and low corruption and prosperous country. So it's a very interesting case. This is a case where you've had certainly the elimination of a military dictatorship has had a really positive impact there, and it's become a relatively free and quite democratic country. As I say, they just had a presidential election, a relatively close, hard-fought election, and that seems like a quite healthy democracy. And so it is interesting. They talk about it that I guess it's been in a good place, and there's not much positive change you can get. Bolivia has probably changed a lot positively compared to when Morella, I think that's his name. But he's been president for 2 terms. I think he wants to get a 3rd term. Certainly, it's become a more probably a more fair society as a result. So you've had that. You've had that in Paraguay. Argentina keeps on going up and down. It's gone up, whatever that means really. Brazil, I would have to say, to be fair, probably, in my opinion, it's probably more. It's just that we're hearing a lot about these corruption cases in Brazil. It's like getting pushed out more. Ecuador is a member of OPEC, so you might be interested in that. It is an OPEC country. Its oil is not that important, but it has more oil than some other countries. But it is a member of OPEC, and I confess that that's a country I don't know. Don't know a lot about. Peru is interesting because the descendant of a Japanese, Fujimori, was president of that country, and they still have the family has quite a strong, is still quite powerful in that country. What's interesting is that he may have been descended from Japanese, but boy, he acted really Spanish. He was really, it was like, boy, he may have been Japanese descent, but he sure acted like he was descended from the Spanish, I don't know. He got the system real well. But he was quite a strong, very strong ruler. It was very interesting, very much in the tradition of the Caudillo, the strong man, President Fujimori. I think he lives in this country. No, he lives in Japan. I think he did come here. He basically, I think he was in jail. They jailed him after he was president, and then I think he eventually came here. What was interesting, when he couldn't speak any Japanese, so it was kind of a curious situation. But any rate, that is that's a country that had a lot of political turmoil, a lot of rebel. There was a lot of rebel terrorism in that country. A rebel group called Shining Path that caused a lot of chaos for 2 or 3 decades in that country. Colombia is another country that's had a lot of the FARC, a lot of political upheaval, a revolutionary group, a revolutionary / kind of drug gang group, a lot of kidnapping. They controlled large areas of the country, especially in the south, and certain part of that was fueled by the drug trade to the United States. So this is a country that's kind of it's struggled. Seems like it's gone in the right direction, although they're saying it's a little bit more corrupt. I would say it seems that there's been a lot of improvement compared to what it was 15 years ago. So I find that interesting. The GDP growth rate, and this is interesting. You really haven't had, Chile has done fairly well actually in relative to the world economy. Peru and Bolivia. This has been driven, but this economic growth has been driven by strong commodity prices. They have a lot of commodities. Copper, for example, the copper mining and other mining, and a lot of this is minerals go to Asia. And China, not just China is certainly a big buyer, but other Asian countries as well. If you're doing a lot of steel manufacturing, you're going to get a lot of minerals, a lot of metal mining from Peru and Bolivia. Of course, we've had the economic collapse in Venezuela, but otherwise it hasn't been an exciting. It's certainly not a terrible time like what we've had in Britain. I'm sorry, in Europe and North America. Now we'll move on to Oceania. This is obviously, these two countries, Australia and New Zealand, are kind of like that European tradition. So again, this is London-based, and these are countries that are, especially New Zealand, these are very familiar. They have political systems that are very familiar to the people who make these ratings. And so, and culturally, there's cultural similarities, and you have to keep that in mind. We have to keep that in mind. When we're talking about that, we're talking about some of these ratings, to some degree, cultural similarity, Northern European. These are Northern Europeans that are making the ratings, and of course, for them, Northern European countries have a wonderful system. They're a wonderful, transparent system, so keep that in mind. Australia, for some reason, is a little bit lower. I don't know. It's a pretty open country. I've only been there once, but I certainly know a lot of Australians, and it's like Europe, really. I mean, these are countries very strongly influenced by Britain, very, very strongly influenced by Britain. We can see, otherwise we're getting, that's Papua New Guinea there, right, there. That's I mean, in a way, Papua New Guinea is almost a colony of Australia. It was a British colony. It still had the British have let go, but the Australians really have a lot of control. control there. There's East Timor there, Timor-Leste, and then Indonesia there. Indonesia will come up on both of our maps there. Not much. There's not much change. I mean, it's just there's one of the things when you have a stable political system, it doesn't change much. So, these scores I don't think they really mean very much. New Zealand was considered one of the highest scores in the world. It went down a few points, and that's why it had nowhere to go but down. So that doesn't really mean it doesn't mean very much. And the same thing with Australia. It's a functioning, a very strong functioning political system, and all. Indonesia is interesting. Indonesia has seen, I think, a lot of improvement. The current president is very democratically elected. Some reform-minded. Seems genuinely interested in reforming the country, and there do seem to be some changes that are going on in that country. Positive changes. And I've only been to Bali. I'd like to. It would be interesting to go to Jakarta. I haven't been there. It's one of the few countries in that part of in this part of the world that I haven't been to. As I say, I've been to Bali, but otherwise that hardly counts. But this is the center of Java. That's the island of Java there. That's the center of the country. It's about 100 million people that live on. If you think about it, right there, there's 100 million people, even more than 100 million people that live right just on that island. And here's Australia with about less than 30 million people. So it's very, very heavily populated. And that's about half the population of Indonesia is on the island of Java there. Well, it's part of the world. There aren't that many countries with GDP growth. Australia has been a little bit below average, but really it's done pretty well compared to a lot of the Western world. It's one of the better performing. It's had a lot of minerals. It's a resource-driven economy. These countries didn't come up. In terms of corruption. I think this is Vanuatu. Which is relatively underdeveloped. I think it's considered somewhat corrupt. I think it was just that there were too few scores, so it was kind of hard for me to put that together. There's Fiji. That's Fiji, which has actually had some problems. If you follow that part, Fiji had some political, some pretty severe political problems, and there was a coup. If I recall, about 8 or 9 years ago, there was a military coup in Fiji, and Fiji's actually had a fairly stable government for a long time. So that was a bit of an event. And you can see Indonesia has done very well. And part of this is the recovery from the 1997 crisis in Indonesia, the Asian crisis. Here's East Asia, and it's a very interesting. It's a very interesting mix from really as diverse. I would have to say East Asia is probably the most diverse region of the world in terms of, and I'm sorry they don't have I think we just had the one score at the 60, so I didn't have enough of a sample, but I think I meant you saw that score is about 60, which would put that probably about a little bit like Taiwan. So as you can see, it would actually, from a relative standpoint, Burundi is not Burundi, I mean Brunei. Sorry, my apologies. Brunei, Brunei is one of the least corrupt countries. As I say, the only reason why I didn't put it there was because of it was just 1 or 2 scores, and it just wasn't comfortable whether that was really reflective of that. And I couldn't tell you why they only have 1 or 2 scores for that, over that period. Some of this I don't understand why they can't come up with something more. What I would want to say here is well, first off, we have, of course, Japan, which is interestingly, curiously on that list, it's not considered a full democracy. That score is just under 8, which again, I don't know what that really means. I mean, Japan is there's a lot of freedom in this country, and I can tell you as a foreigner, I feel like I have to be careful in terms of certain laws. But on the other hand, I'm not the kind of person that's going to run out and do drugs anyway. So that for me, that's not exactly that I feel that's no constraint in my freedom because it's relatively tough on drugs, especially for foreigners. I mean, if you're a foreigner in this country, it's kind of like a pretty good idea not to do illegal drugs. I knew. In fact, I did know somebody that, I remember a guy from Canada, and he got caught and he just a tiny amount of marijuana he ended up. He had a nice career, he got kicked out. So, and I know that when Paul McCartney, you may recall, he was not allowed in the country for more than 50 years because of a marijuana conviction in Britain in the 1960s. So, that's kind of a rule. But otherwise, this is certainly a country with a lot of economic freedom. I had no trouble setting up a company. I've paid my taxes. I follow the regulations. When I've been involved in business, I've never been asked to pay anybody off. Certainly, you have to know what the bureaucrats want. That's part of the game. There's a game here with the bureaucracy. You have to know, and especially if you're in the financial industry, for those people who are interested in the financial industry, the Ministry of Finance, the FSA can be very strict, but that's just, those are the rules. So if you follow, one of the things here is that, of course, what's very interesting is that, and probably the reason why Japan may not get as high of a score is because the way it's a very Asian way that the way that you have control and I think this is a very part of Asian cultures in general, is that the rules are vague. The rules can be generally a little bit vague. There's some things you clearly can't do, and there's some things that you clearly can do, but a lot of the things are gray and they're in the middle, and many of the things that you would like to do are gray, and so then you have to say, well, how much can I do? And that's where you have to go to the bureaucrats here and kind of say, well, what? And you have to ask the question the right way. And you also have to make sure that even when you do something, you can't stand out too much. It's as you know, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down type of thing. So as a result of that may seem like, to people in the West, that's not clear and transparent. It's not necessarily clear and transparent, but when you understand what the rules are, and when you establish your relationships, and you understand the intention of what people want, then you kind of know what you can do and what you can't do. And so, as I say, I would say, so really, I know that people, when you understand that as a foreigner, you can understand what you can do and what you can't do. Well, then you can operate fairly freely within that. So personally, I think this is quite a free country. And actually, in many ways, I think it's more free. There's certain kinds of economic freedom and property rights that are actually much greater than in my country. For example, if you own a property in this country, you have a lot of freedom. You have a lot of freedom as to how you use it. That is considered a very strong property rights. Well, that's if I own a property, I don't. But if I did, I know you have a lot of freedom to do what you want with it. And I assure you, in my country, we have less freedom to do with what we want with if we own land. There's the rules and regulations on what you can do with it. Or even if there are rules and regulations and you follow it, somebody comes in and they say, well, you can't do that anyway. And then they'll sue. They sue, and then and you may not be able to do it even if to me, that's not a lot of freedom. Where here, if I own a property, I can kind of build whatever I want on it, pretty much. Depends on what the zoning in general, a lot of flexibility. So I think there's, as I say, I've been able to establish a business. I've never had any problems with that. It's just, we just do the filings that we need to file, we pay our taxes, and that's it. So I've never had any. I found this to be a very free country, and as I say, I don't think it's any. But certainly compared to a country like Italy, where my wife is from, and where my family, and where my Japanese mother-in-law lives, it's certainly much freer and less corrupt. Certainly a less corrupt country than that. And then we go on from there, and we talk. Of course, these countries, your Taiwan, and I guess if you had Hong Kong, it would probably. There's Singapore. Singapore is what is the highest in Asia. Singapore is quite a free. There's a lot of economic freedom. It's dominated by overseas Chinese, so it's kind of it has that kind of laissez-faire economic freedom that when people of Chinese descent get out of China, that you end up with this kind of thing. So really, there's Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Hong Kong would probably be, if you had that. I didn't put that on here. I think it would probably be pretty close to that. I have to check and see if they have a measurement. I think people would say that it's becoming less, more corrupt. This probably is the case since the handover in 1997. So it's been 20 years now. But these countries were considered called the so-called Asian tigers, and Hong Kong. Those countries were considered the Asian tigers, the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. What's interesting about these countries, these countries started out quite autocratic. Taiwan, of course, when the nationalist Chinese who fled after their defeat by the communists in 1949, their armies fled to the island of Formosa. They've set up the Republic of China as basically the government in waiting. What was interesting was that if you're Chiang Kai-shek was actually trained in Moscow, so he was actually also kind of a communist. It was just the communists that lost. So for the West, he became the good guy since he lost to Mao Zedong. But what was interesting was that when they first went to that island, it was quite a repressive government. It wasn't. It had. Well, it looked more like a communist government and communist political system than than a Western system. Well, what was interesting, and you saw this, and this was also the case in South Korea. South Korea also was a very autocratic country after World War II. There was military run. Both of these countries are very strongly run by the military, as opposed to, well, Japan after the war became, the military, of course, was largely contained, and its power and influence significantly reduced by the American occupation. And so that certainly played a role in Japan becoming a democracy that looked like a Western-style democracy, at least on the surface. Whereas in these two countries, that was not the case. They were more autocratic military governments of military rule. But over time, and also they had a very much kind of a communist, in terms of almost like a communist system. So the system was actually fairly communist, socialist system. But over time, and here was the interesting thing. Over time, the private sector grew. It wasn't that the public sector really shrank. It's just that it kind of stayed the same size, but that the private sector grew so much as the countries developed. And then, as that developed, what was interesting about both Taiwan and South Korea. And I have memory in my lifetime, certainly remember both of them being quite militaristic. I mean, I can of course remember when Chiang Kai-shek was alive, both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. But he died in the 70s as well. Anyway, so it was. So these countries slowly, as their economies grew. And this is an interesting point. I want to think about China. We think about China. As the economies of these societies grew, they became more free. They achieved more political freedom. But still, even South Korea, I remember the military kind of ran the country until 1980. 1980, and then President Park. You'll hear a lot of Parks because they've been kind of family. And the recent president that resigned was, I think her father was the president of Park. I think that was the, and he was kind of a military ruler, he became president in around 1980. Around that time, South Korea became more politically open. And the interesting thing, you also had something similar that happened in Thailand. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to stay focused on these countries. But as you basically had the military became less and less powerful. As people's became economically more secure, they wanted. The systems became more democratic. So that's clearly, that they have a lower score. But again, I would say, they're, again, this is probably a little bit of a Western bias. They're systems that don't quite reflect, Western values, but they're quite open. They're quite open, free societies. I know certainly Taiwan is quite a. I've been there a couple of times, and I find it it's quite economic. People are pretty free to do economically pretty much what they want there. And of course, that's the same in South Korea. So those two countries became more politically free as the private sectors grew. So that was kind of, and for the West, we kind of think, oh, okay, well this shows how as economies improve, then they become more Western. They look like they're more Western. The reality, of course, is something different. And this is where you get a country like Singapore. right there, which is considered to be quite a free society. And I think if you've been to Singapore, that's a very open. It's a very open society. A lot of different cultures. There are certainly strong Indian overseas, as well as Chinese. So you have those elements, and not so much the Malay, of course. As you know, this was once part of the Malaysian Federation, and in 1965, the Malaysian Federation kicked Singapore out, which seemed pretty silly now. And what's interesting is that, and Nazri, of course, this is something that you probably could get up and lecture to me a lot more about this, and if you're interested in talking about it, I'd be happy to listen. The Malaysian Federation, it is a federation of kind of sultans. It's a kind of it's of course an Islamic country, and that was probably one of the reasons why they kicked Singapore. That wasn't Muslim majority, but it's an Islamic country, and all of those were different sultanates, and the Burundi is the only. Here, Burundi is the only example of a sultanate that didn't in this region. Of course, this is the island Borneo, and this part is Indonesia. I met somebody who lives there, but those were the sultanates, and that was the only one that didn't become. And if you want, Nazir, if you want to talk about that, I don't know very much. All I know is that all of these are actually a number of different sultanates, and that is the Malaysian Federation. It's a federation. Malaysia is a federation of sultanates, and particularly, as I understand, the island of Borneo, that is the case. The Borneo are all former sultanates.
There was actually a rebellion, like when they planned to join. The decision whether to join Malaysia or not. Then there was a rebellion.
In your country?
Yeah, for not wanting to, participate.
And was that when did that take place?
Sometime in 1960s, if I'm not mistaken.
So it was in the 1960s. So because the Singapore was expelled from the Federation in 1965. So that was, and also in 1965 there was the crisis in Indonesia. There was kind of like a Suharto came to power. President Suharto, if you may not remember him, but you're too young to remember him, but he was a strong man that came to, Suharto came to power in 1965 and ruled the country for 40 years with a quite iron fist. So that was in Indonesia. And so this was kind of part of the, needless to say, if you were in Singapore in 1965, you didn't feel very secure, and those people didn't, and they Lee Kok, was it Lee Kok Song? Is that
the first?
Yes, the original Lee.
Wait.
Is that? Am I close? I think I'm
close, but
it's close. I don't think that. At any rate, he passed away about 10 years ago, I think. Quite revered figure. But they set up you have to remember, they were surrounded by a very hostile. The Malays didn't want them. They got kicked out there. They were next to Indonesia, and so they kind of felt that they were quite isolated. But what they had was a port, a great port. Of course, Singapore was a British colony, and in the 19th century had become was made an important port by the British in the 19th century. So if, when you go there, you can see there's still a lot of the old colonial, the architecture. There's a fair bit of architecture in Singapore from the late 19th century. So, so it's quite and right on the equator, pretty much right on the equator. I think within 1 degree of the equator. But as I say, it's in an important shipping lane. That's why the British set that up. Is a great location for shipping, right in the sea of the Strait of Malacca, right there. So that's a strategic, and it's an island, so you can defend it. And if you've ever read the Battle of Singapore, the British really, it's a real interesting read. The Japanese. Have you ever studied anything about the battle of the movement of the Japanese army down the Malaysian Peninsula?
No.
It's a fascinating read. It actually was a great it's considered one of the great military. The general who did that was a brilliant military strategist. And he went down, he didn't have a lot of troops, he basically conquered, and the British were absolutely incredibly incompetent. The British general the British military in Singapore then were absolutely, utterly incompetent. But anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. But it is military, so it really is, the point was they should have been able to hold. They should have been able to hold from the Japanese, but they didn't. They didn't have their act together. But that is a strategic. It's quite a strategic location. Very end of the peninsula, island off the coast, right in this strait. Absolutely crucial, and really one of the most important ports in the world. But the point is that after the expulsion, Lee set up. They set up a fairly autocratic society, economically free, but politically quite a bit of repression. You know, just but also a society that was had what you would call a very Asian, what they called the very Asian characteristics. A lot of state control of the economy, and a lot of state control in terms of investment. That the people were taxed. The taxes went to fund investment by the government. The Government Investment Corporation of Singapore. For example, if you're familiar, I worked with the Government Investment Corporation of Singapore here, so I did a lot of work with them, so I was quite familiar. They've done a lot of investment in Japan, and I worked with them and with an American investor that was in a fund, so I got to know the Singaporeans quite well, and the Government Investment Corporation of Singapore quite well as a result of that. But so there was a lot of state control. So Singapore has a lot of, and they're still quite strong. I mean, so it's interesting how here and this is where I want you to think about, Hanako, in terms of your that's a very high score, but. You know, part of it as well. It's kind of a former British colony, and there's a lot of British bankers there, and they're allowed to make a lot of money, so they think it's a real free and cool place. And that's kind of, I would keep that in mind. There's a lot of government control there. That if there weren't a lot of Brits there, if there weren't a lot of British, they would probably have a lower score. That's what I would guess. But that said, it's a fair bit of freedom. Then Malaysia is actually a fairly reasonably, fairly open society. I say fairly. It's certainly a complex society, as it's certainly a mix of Malay and Chinese some Western, but not much. And would you consider, are you Malay? So you're ethnically Malay. And and certainly there's been that, the way that society has, because it's about 50%, it's almost even. I think there's a little bit higher percentage of Malay than Chinese, what is it, maybe 55-45, 60-40, something like that.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
In where?
In Malaysia?
I think so.
It's about 60-50, something like that. It's fairly even. And one of the things about the overseas Chinese have wherever they go, they end up kind of running the local economies. I mean, that's the Chinese, it's Chinese culture. And that's true in Thailand. If you go to Thailand, the very strong, the overseas Chinese, very strong in Thailand. They're very strong in the Philippines. They're very, very strong. Some of the richest people in the Philippines are Chinese. Malaysia, that's true. Of course, Singapore, all of that. Indonesia, it's a much smaller percentage, but again, it's like 9-10% of the country's population, but are ethnically Chinese. But they run they run much of the economy in Indonesia. So they have a powerful influence overall in terms of how that's run. But certainly in Malaysia, there's kind of an effort to have a balance there. The laws are structured so that there's a little bit of favoritism towards the Malays. Chinese resent it. There's a lot of, and I know there's a lot of cultural resentment. I met Chinese Malays, and there's certainly a lot of cultural friction between the two groups. That's certainly there, but somehow they get along. It kind of works. It's worked. And it's quite relatively prosperous country, so it is quite interesting. It's somewhat democratic, somewhat free. You can go there, and there's a bit of corruption. We've had the current prime minister is kind of embroiled in what looks like actually it looks like a lot of corruption. It looks like they funnel a lot of money from Petrobras. Not Petrobras, but is it Petrobras?
$1 million, something.
More than $1 billion. Is it Petrobras? Is the Petronas? Yeah, the petroleum country. It's quite a scandal. It's pretty. Somehow the prime minister is surviving it, but it's pretty obvious that they stole. They set up a fund that was supposed to be for the advancement of the country, and they stole more than, I think, at least $1 billion, if not more money. So it's pretty. So that's been a bit of a problem the last, and he's still in power. So the current prime minister. So he's survived that. That's the situation. Thailand is a very interesting country because, as I say, it does have very strong. It was the only country that did not officially become and Southeast Asia did not officially become a colony of, and they're quite proud. Siam, that's the term. Actually, the country is Siam, but Siam, they're quite proud that they didn't. Some people think the British just decided they liked to have, it was a buffer state. It acted as a bit of a buffer state between, this was the former, this was all part of British India, including Burma. So Burma was part of British India, so that they kind of wanted to have a buffer. For the British, they liked the buffer state between them and the French territories. This was French Indochina. These three countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were run by the French. So this is the Europeans came in the 19th century. They wanted to do the same thing in Asia as they did in Africa. did a pretty good job of it in terms of taking over the influence that they had. Certainly the British ran all of India here, the French ran this, the British ran here. Of course, this was Indonesia. Indonesia played a powerful role. It was a Dutch colony until after World War II. Well, actually, the Japanese kind of drove out. But a lot of that was, this was a Dutch colony for hundreds of years. That was based on the spice trade. That was the original, the spice, it was the spice trade that the Dutch established that. This was that was British, that's Sri Lanka. You know, so that, all of that, of course, this was basically Spanish, and then became an American colony, actually, after the war, 1898. Became an American colony for 40 years. So this was all the European, that was kind of an extension of the fun and games that the Europeans were doing in Africa. They wanted to go run out and colonize the world. And as you know, Japan's great story about avoiding that, the great industrialization of the late 19th century. Do you study it? How much have you studied about Japan's industrialization? Because it really is, it's an interesting, I think it's a fascinating story as to why Japan stayed independent, really, and what Japan did to do that. That's kind of outside this, but it is interesting how that Japan really was the only country that stayed really free of European influence. China was taken over. I mean, China, and just ask any of your Chinese colleagues, you know, what they feel about the Europeans and what the Europeans did in the 19th century in China. This is, right now, it's payback time for the Chinese. Chinese are definitely getting, it's payback time for the Europeans in terms of that. That's one of the things that's going on there. Let me just check the time here. I'm spending a lot of time on Asia because this is the part of the world we live in, and certainly, but I think it's also a fascinating story, and I think it's worth taking the time to talk about these political systems and all. But anyway, let me get back to Thailand. Thailand was also very similar in terms of military. It's looked a lot like Taiwan, like South Korea. The very strong military government. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. had a lot of many military bases here that they were conducting operations both in Cambodia and Vietnam. So that was part of it. So there was a lot of American influence. So that certainly had an impact. That kind of westernized that it became more Western. But so it's kind of had a flavor of a mixture of military and democratically elected governments. I personally have spent a lot of time a fair bit of time in Thailand. Most of that time in Bangkok. But so you do have a feeling of a country that's somewhat free. You know, there's a bit of freedom, a bit of repression, a bit of freedom, some political turmoil. You know, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting place, and reasonably economic. Again, you know, it's interesting. It's kind of considered about like there's a lot of corruption. You know, I certainly feel a fair bit of corruption. You could see at least. And I knew somebody there that knew a lot of military. He did business there, and he knew a lot of military figures, and I heard a lot of really interesting stories from this guy. So you know, he knew what was really going on there. You know, but it certainly does stand out in contrast from the countries around it. It is, as I say, relatively a free and at least reasonably open country. Then you talk about. These countries, the former French Indochina, of course, dominated by Vietnam, which is a communist country. It was like Korea, was divided between North and South, a communist North and a capitalist south. The Vietnam, the war was fought with the United States. That became, the United States was driven out in 1975. That became a single unified country. Then it has developed. It's still a autocratic country. It's still very autocratic. It's still a communist country. But certainly, but it has developed. There has been a fair bit of economic development there. People can travel freely. I have a nephew that now he married a Vietnamese and he lives in Ho Chi Minh City. I have to get down there to see him. They had a couple of babies that were they had a couple of twin babies that were in the hospital there. But so I have to get down there. That's a country I've never been to yet, but I'll have to go visit. It certainly has gotten rid of, well, it got rid of us Americans, certainly. These two countries, Laos and a lot less, these were always less free countries. They certainly were more autocratic. Cambodia is quite a autocratic country. I think the political system very, very corrupt. Everything that I've heard, anybody that's been there, you feel a lot of. They tell me they feel a lot of corruption. This is the same thing with Myanmar. That is you used to call it Burma. That is the military took over that country in the mid-1960s. Again, very, very repressive. Just a military, not really even I wouldn't even say it's a communist. They ran as a socialist country, but it's really just a military. It was basically just the play toy of the society of the military. It's recently it's more democratic. Now you have these refugees, these Muslim refugees in this part of the country. I won't try to pronounce it, but I know that there's a group of people right here that are kind of ethnically more related. They're ethnically a bit more related to the Bengalis. I think my understanding is that they were ethnically Bengali. Yeah, so there's been and there's a refugee crisis. If you're following, about 500,000 people they've been forced to flee across the border into Bangladesh. That is a country it's developing. That it's a lot of repression. You're talking about decades of very, very strong military rule. That's Bangladesh, one of the world's densest countries. That is part of. That was after the breakup of India, of British India. This was all Pakistan. Believe it or not, that was one country for about 25 years. 1947 to 1971. 1947 to 1971. That was considered East Pakistan. They were Islamic, but that was the only thing they had in common. They had nothing else in common. These are Bengalis. These are the Pakistanis. More Indian. Well, it's really kind of Indian ethnically, but that is a country that's had. This is an example of a corrupt but democratic country. That's what's interesting about Bangladesh is that it's very corrupt. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of corruption, but it's a very democratic country. So here's where you would get a fairly high. I think they have. What you want to do, Hanako, is check that to see the score. I think it's a fairly the democracy. It's a fairly they have elections, they're all the presidents are all. And curious thing is the women. They've had a lot of women presidents, you know. So it's kind of an interesting. It's a Muslim country that's run by, at least at the top, by women, and they're. But it's been very. I'm going to say it's a lot of corruption. It's kind of held back its development. Of course, then you could just spend a whole course talking about China, and you can see that they have in terms of corruption, it's relatively low, and that's a fascinating. I think the thing is, what score do you give to China? You know, what do you do? You know, it's obviously a very, it's clearly a corrupt country. I mean, in terms of doing business, you have the relationships that you have to establish. You have to get to know the government officials. There's certainly a lot of expectation. The government is kind of woven into everything. It's a communist country, and I say communist because really the Chinese culturally are really capitalist people. Which is bad. You know, I think. I mean, when the communists put suits on, it was pretty easy for them to do. To me, Japan is much more a communist country than China. You know, I would call Japan is really a communist country in terms of its society is genuinely social, has much more of a socialist, a collective bent. And China is very independent, kind of capitalist, naturally capitalist country. So it's kind of interesting. You know, they love money. Chinese love money and all. And so that's a fascinating. The whole the complexity, of course, of it. So it's interesting how they give such a low, such a relatively high score. You know, it's very complex, and as you say, it's a country with very little political freedom, but it's a fair bit of economic freedom, very little political freedom. It's corrupt, but it's not. It's it's a whole fascinating study in and of itself. A lot of repression, as you know. I was reading that. And a lot of it just has to do with Beijing holding the territory. You know, the ability of Beijing to hold this territory and to keep this from breaking up into a lot of different countries is just the degree of repression. And so the degree of repression and control that Beijing can have over the country. I was talking with someone talking about business a couple weeks ago, and this person was telling me how they have some contacts that they try to get further away from Beijing. They don't want to do business in Beijing because there's more control there. The further away you get from Beijing, there's less control. So I'll continue that. We're almost at the end. I think I almost. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll spend the next lecture. We have 2 more lectures. If anybody wants to talk about your project, I'm certainly I'll be happy to talk with you in the next room. I think you need to get going on to start doing your a little bit of analysis. Start sending me some stuff, and we'll talk about that. Nazri, you sent me something this morning. We'll go over that. I know Did you send me anything yet?
Sorry, I sent.
You did?
I did.
Okay, I'll take a look at that, and we'll need to talk to see where you're at. But good to see you. Good to see you back. I'll be in the next room before the start of the class. If you want to talk to me then. We will be gone on holiday for the next 3 weeks. So, I will be around. If anybody wants to get together and talk, I really urge you to spend this time doing. This is a time where you'll get an opportunity to do work on your project. So please do that. Please stay in touch, And, well, we'll see you in 3 weeks' time.